Well now, are you settled? If so, then let's do our little trick. Keep your eyes slightly open, not enough to focus on anything properly, just enough to let the room become softer around you. Let the darkness stay where it is without trying to make sense of every corner, and you'll find that the longer you try to stay awake, the sooner sleep will come. Allow the bed to carry you for a while. Feel yourself settling further into it with each slow breath. There's nothing you need to hold up anymore, so just stay still. And if you notice a second reflection in the window tonight, though you're certain you're alone in the room, pay it no mind. It usually disappears once it thinks you've fallen asleep. Now, let's begin tonight's stories. It doesn't take many people to ruin a man's name. One person speaks first, a second person repeats it, a third adds a detail that was never there. After a while, the story no longer belongs to anyone. It walks around by itself. It enters rooms before the man does. It waits beside machines, tables, doorways, and gates. It changes shape depending on who tells it, but the damage remains the same. Truth rarely stops it once it's started. People enjoy a good story too much. Bitterness often begins with disappointment. Somebody wants something from another person. They don't get it. Instead of accepting the hurt honestly, they decide the other person deserves to pay for it. That was what happened to Colm Joyce. His father, Jimmy, was buried on a Thursday in early March. By Friday evening, the neighbours had gone back to their own houses. By Saturday, people were talking about weather, rent, livestock, and the usual local troubles. By Monday morning, Colm was back in the factory because grief had no authority over wages. The factory stood near the edge of town, close enough to the river that the damp gathered in the brick during winter. It made parts for farm machinery, hinges, fittings, bolts, brackets, and anything else a customer could order in enough quantity. The building had tall windows, hard floors, and machines that kept a man aware of his hands at all times. Colm had worked there since he was 17. He was 32 when Jimmy died. He knew the place as well as any man could know a workplace. He knew which machines ran cleanly and which ones needed coaxing. He knew which belts had to be watched. He knew when Dave Curley, the foreman, was in a mood to listen and when a man would be better off solving his own problem. Colm got on well enough with most people. He wasn't unfriendly. He could sit at a table, talk, laugh when there was a reason, and pass a lunch break without making things awkward. But there was a private part of him people rarely reached. He didn't give trust away because he had learned early that some people treated trust as a tool once they held it. Sissy Davern had been different. She had worked beside him for years. At first, they'd only spoken during breaks. Then they began sharing tea. Then one winter they started walking part of the road home together because their houses lay in the same direction. Over time, a friendship settled between them in a way that felt natural. Sissy knew more about Colm than anyone else in the factory. She knew he kept people at a distance. She knew Jimmy Joyce had been the one person whose opinion truly mattered to him. She knew Colm had been worried about his father for months before the end came. She knew how little he slept during that final week, and after the funeral, she was good to him. That was the cruelest part later on. At the time, it felt like kindness. She brought him food when he hadn't bothered buying any in. She sat with him at the kitchen table and spoke about ordinary things when he couldn't face heavier ones. She mended the cuff of his work coat because he had torn it and hadn't cared enough to fix it himself. "You'd go to work looking like you'd been dragged backward through a hedge," she said. "I've gone in looking worse." "I know, I've seen you." He wanted to smile at this, and if he did, it was faint. Those evenings helped him. He never said it outright, but she knew. 3 weeks after the funeral, she came by after work. It was a wet afternoon, and the road outside was scattered with puddles. Colm made tea. Sissy sat opposite him, hands around the cup. For a while they spoke about Jimmy, just small memories. Jimmy refused to buy a new hat, even when the old one had gone soft at the brim. Jimmy claiming he could hear a badly oiled hinge from 2 fields away. Jimmy standing in the yard with a mug in his hand, giving out about neighbours while secretly liking half of them. Sissy listened closely, and then the room went quiet. She reached across the table and placed her hand over Colm's. He looked down, and when he looked back at her, he understood. "I've wanted to do that for a while," she said. Colm didn't pull his hand away sharply. He moved carefully because she mattered to him and because the moment deserved care. "Sissy." "Oh, don't say my name like that." "I have to say something." She drew her hand back. "You don't feel the same, do you?" "It's just, with everything that's going on, I don't know what I feel at the moment." "Well, that's a gentle way of saying no." "I'm just trying to be honest." Her eyes stayed on him. "It's just, with my father gone," he said, "I'm getting through each day because the day comes and I've no choice. I'm not fit for anything more than that." "This isn't about your father, is it?" "It is, Sissy, it is for me." She looked toward the fire. Colm leaned in. "You've been a great friend to me, Sissy, really." "Oh, that word, friend." "Yeah, but I mean it with respect." "That's not how it feels, Colm." "I'm sorry, Sissy." She stood and picked up her coat. He stood with her. "I don't want this to damage anything between us." Sissy looked at him from the doorway. "That isn't only up to you." She left before he could answer. The following Monday, everything had changed. Sissy didn't sit near him at breakfast break. She didn't ask how he was. She laughed louder than usual with Lar Hines near the far bench and glanced over from time to time to make sure Colm had heard. Lar was a big man with a talent for finding an audience. If a joke could be made louder, Lar made it louder. If a story could be worsened, he gave it help. By midday, he was making remarks. "Oh, some lads are very delicate with other people's feelings." A few workers laughed. Colm kept his head down and worked. By Tuesday, Fionnuala Flanagan had joined in. Fionnuala could carry a story through a building faster than steam through a pipe. She rarely invented everything herself. She preferred taking the truth and dressing it until it looked more interesting. By the end of the week, people were saying Colm had led Sissy on. By the end of the week, they were saying he'd used her kindness after the funeral. After that, the story grew fangs. He had promised her things. He had changed when she believed him. He had made a fool of her. None of it was true, of course. The worst part was that no one asked him. People enjoyed the version they'd been given. It had shape. It had betrayal. It had a villain. Truth would have only spoiled the entertainment. Colm tried to let it pass. He had always been good at silence. Silence had protected him in life more than speeches ever had. He worked, went home, ate what he could, slept poorly, and returned the next day. But repetition wears a man down. Lar made comments when Colm crossed the floor. Fionnuala whispered loudly enough to be heard. Sissy never said the worst things directly. That was how she kept herself clean. She allowed others to carry the dirt. Then, one afternoon, Colm passed her near the storeroom. "Sissy," he said. She stopped and said, "What?" "Can we talk?" "I think we already did talk." "What these people are saying, I didn't do any of it." She looked at him with a coldness he'd never seen in her before. "People make up their own minds, Colm." "You told them things that weren't true, didn't you?" Colm replied. Her mouth hardened. "You think very highly of yourself, don't you, Colm Joyce?" "I thought highly of you." That struck a nerve with her. For a second, the old Sissy seemed close to the surface, but then she turned away. "You should go back to work." Colm watched her go. That Sunday, he walked to the cemetery. Jimmy's grave was near the back, beside a yew that had grown unevenly over the years. The earth was still raised. Rain had blotted the new headstone. Cullum stood there, cap in hand. He hadn't planned to speak, but the words came anyway. "Dad, I know this sounds a bit stupid." He looked down at the name cut into the stone. "I don't know what else to do with it." He told his father everything. He told him about Sissy, about the kitchen table, about trying to be decent, about Monday morning, about Lar, Fionnuala, and the little remarks that followed him across the factory floor. "I didn't hurt her the way they're saying," he said. "I didn't want to hurt her at all." He stayed there until the light began to fade. When he finally turned for home, he felt no great relief. He felt only a little less burdened, and at that stage, a little less was good enough. A few minutes after Cullum left, a robin landed on Jimmy Joyce's headstone. It stayed there in the rain. The first change happened to Lar Hines. At the start, people laughed about it. Lar arrived one morning complaining that his trousers had grown tight. "The dinner's catching you," one man said. "I eat less than you." "You'd want to, or there'd be no food left in the parish." Lar laughed with them that day. A week later, he'd gone up another belt hole. By the next week, another. The change was too fast for comfort. His work hadn't changed, his food hadn't changed, yet every few weeks he seemed heavier, broader, less able to move easily between benches and crates. The jokes turned back on him, and Lar disliked that. He liked laughter when he held it in his own hands. He disliked being carried by it. One afternoon he called across the workshop as Cullum passed. "Careful now, lads. He'll break your heart and tell you it's bad timing." Several workers laughed. An hour later, Lar bent to lift a crate and split the seam of his trousers from hip to knee. The sound carried across the floor, and the laughter this time was much louder. Lar went red and tied his coat around his waist for the rest of the shift. Fionnuala Hennigan changed next. A mark appeared near the corner of her mouth, a sort of hairy mole. She covered it with powder. 2 more appeared the following week. After that, the marks gathered around her lips and chin. The doctor gave her an ointment. It did nothing. She began checking her reflection in windows and polished metal. Others suffered too. A young labourer named Gavin developed a rash across both forearms after laughing at Lar's remarks for weeks. A woman who repeated Fionnuala's stories began losing hair in small patches. One man developed a swelling under his ear after spreading a claim about Cullum in the canteen. Nobody connected the pieces at first. People blamed food, weather, bad air, the machines, the factory doctor, anything except their own mouths. Dave Curley watched more carefully than most. He was old enough to know that people often recognized truth long before they admitted it. He had also watched Cullum through the entire campaign. Cullum hadn't threatened anyone. He hadn't raised a hand. He hadn't answered cruelty with cruelty. One evening, Dave found Lar alone near the loading doors. Lar was breathing heavily after carrying a crate. "You should leave him be," Dave said. Lar looked over. "Who?" "You know who." Lar wiped his forehead with his sleeve. "I was only having a bit of sport." "Well, you've had enough sport." Lar said nothing to this. Dave looked toward the factory floor. "Funny thing, Gavin stopped laughing at Cullum last week, and his arms, they're nearly cleared." Lar thought about this. Dave walked away before Lar could reply. The next day, Lar kept quiet. Nothing happened. He kept quiet the day after that too. By Friday, the weight gain had stopped. Lar didn't tell anyone at first. He was afraid speaking it aloud might start it again, but he stopped joining in and people noticed. Gavin went further. He sat beside Cullum during a break. "I joined in a few times," Gavin said. Cullum looked at him. "I know. I shouldn't have." Cullum returned his attention to his lunch. "No, you probably shouldn't." And that was all. By the end of the week, Gavin's rash had almost disappeared. After that, the fear spread quickly. Not fear of Cullum, fear of whatever had begun answering on his behalf. The campaign lost its audience. Lara stayed silent. Fionnuala stopped sharing stories. The woman losing her hair apologized to Cullum in a corridor and cried afterward from relief when the shedding stopped. One by one, the factory workers withdrew from Sissy, and that left her exposed. She had begun the thing. She had fed it. She had watched others carry it. Now she couldn't pretend it had nothing to do with her. At first, Sissy fought against the change. She kept making remarks, even after people stopped laughing. She spoke loudly at breaks and found no one willing to join her. The more the factory pulled away from her, the harsher her face became. Then her own punishment began. It didn't show as boils or swelling. It showed as life, leaving her. She arrived looking worn down, even after Sundays. She stopped sleeping properly. She missed simple work she had done for years. She stared across the floor at Cullum, as if waiting for him to reveal how he managed it. He gave her nothing, and that seemed to trouble her most. One evening, after most workers had gone, she found him near the back door. "Are you pleased with yourself?" she asked. Cullum turned and said, "No." "You expect me to believe that?" "I don't expect anything from you now, Sissy." That hurt her because it was calm. She stepped in closer. "People are afraid to speak around you, do you know that?" "Well, maybe they should speak better." Sissy looked away. For the first time in months, she seemed uncertain rather than angry. "I was humiliated, Cullum," she said. "I know. You made me feel so small." "I told you the truth as gently as I could, Sissy. I wasn't trying to reject you. There was a lot going on." Sissy looked back at him. "You could have lied." "I could have," Cullum said, "but I felt you deserved the truth." That answer gave her nowhere to go. The factory was quiet around them. Sissy looked down with a sort of shame across her face. "I let it go too far, didn't I?" "Maybe, yeah." "I just wanted people on my side." "Well, you got them." She closed her eyes briefly, and when she spoke again, her voice had lost the sharpness. "I'm sorry, Cullum." Cullum looked at her for a long time. He had imagined apologies during the worst weeks. He had imagined speeches, anger, justice, all the things a man imagines when he's hurt and alone. When the apology finally came, he had no use for any of it. "Thank you," he said. Sissy seemed to expect more, but Cullum had no more to give. The factory changed after that. Slowly, Lara lost the extra weight over the following months. Fionnuala's marks faded. Gavin's arms cleared. The other complaints disappeared in the same plain way they'd arrived. Nobody spoke of curses. Nobody spoke of Jimmy Joyce. Nobody spoke of the robin because only Cullum had seen it, and even he had kept that to himself. Work returned to its old patterns. Sissy and Cullum never became what they'd been. Too much had happened, but they learned to share the same rooms again. They spoke when work required it. Sometimes, years later, they even managed kindness, though careful kindness, the sort that keeps its hands where both people can see them. The last sign came during a night shift. Cullum was carrying parts to the far end of the factory when he glanced toward a window. The glass reflected the lamps inside, but beyond the reflection he saw a small shape on the outer sill. A robin. It stood there looking in. Cullum set down the crate. The bird remained, lit by the glow of the factory lamps. Cullum thought of the cemetery. He thought of Jimmy's grave. He thought of the rain on the headstone and the words he had spoken because he had nowhere else to put them. The shift whistle sounded. Cullum looked toward the noise, and when he looked back, the robin was gone. Outside, above the dark yard and the road beyond it, a small bird lifted from the factory roof and flew away into the night. No one else saw it. That seemed right. The factory would remember the strange months in its own way. People would explain them with illness, chance, bad nerves, and bad luck. People are good at making the world ordinary again after it frightens them. Cullum never claimed to know what had happened. He only knew this. After he spoke at his father's grave, the cruelty began answering for itself, and from time to time, when he passed through the cemetery, he would look toward Jimmy Joyce's headstone and see a robin perched somewhere nearby, watching, making certain, perhaps, that the story had ended where it should. The rain had stopped outside the undertaker's shop. Drops still fell from the roof in the yard, one drop at a time. A coffin rested on two wooden stands near the bench. The lid was finished, but not yet fixed down. John sat near the stove with his coat still buttoned. Fran stood at the bench, scraping dried glue from a corner joint, and John said, "How long have you been doing this?" 32 years. "And it doesn't bother you?" "What, the work?" "No, the reason for the work." Fran set the scraper down. "No, not the way you mean." "Ah, come on, I don't believe you." "Well, that's all right." "It's not all right. It makes no sense to me. You spend your life measuring people for coffins and laying them out and closing lids, meeting families who can barely speak, and you're telling me death doesn't trouble you." "I didn't say it doesn't trouble me. I said I'm not afraid of it. Those are two completely different things. Plenty about this work troubles me. A mother standing over a child, a husband trying to decide which dress his wife should wear when he can barely say her name, a family arguing over money in the same room as the dead man who earned it. That troubles me. The dead themselves don't. They never have." John said, "Well, that's the bit I can't understand." "It's because you're putting too many things under one word. People say death, but they mean pain, or they mean leaving the family, or they mean being forgotten, or they mean hell, or they mean there being nothing after. Those are all different fears. If you mix them together, of course it becomes too big to look at." "Fine, okay, look, I'll make it simple. I'm afraid of stopping. I can't make it any simpler than that. I'm afraid that one day I'll be here thinking, remembering, wanting things, worrying about things, enjoying things, and then it all ends. I know people dress it up. They say it's natural. They say it happens to everyone. They say I won't know anything about it when it happens. I've heard all that, but none of it helps me. I don't want to stop being me." Fran wiped the scraper on the rag. "That's the best way to put it." "Is it?" "Yes. Most people talk around it. You've said the actual thing." "Then answer the actual thing." "I'll try. I don't think you're afraid of being dead. I think you're afraid of now, while you're alive, imagining being dead. That might sound like I'm playing with words, but I'm not. The fear is happening here, in this room, in your head. The man in the coffin isn't lying there upset because he can't have tea. He isn't missing a fire. He isn't annoyed that his boots are still under the bed. The wanting has stopped, you see. The worrying has stopped. The man who feared death is not there to feel cheated by it." Then John said, "That's the argument I hate most." "Why?" "Because it sounds like someone trying to win on a technicality. What you're saying is I won't mind being gone because I won't exist to mind it. Grand, I understand the point, but it doesn't touch the real fear. I'm afraid of the loss itself. I don't have to be around after the loss to hate the idea of it now." "Well, that's a fair point." "It is fair, isn't it? If a man tells me my house will burn down tomorrow while I'm away, I don't need to be sitting in the flames for that to bother me. The loss matters now. The thought of it matters now. And if death is the loss of everything I am, then telling me I won't be there afterwards isn't comfort. It's the very thing I'm afraid of." Fran took his time before answering. "Well, I can't knock that down completely." "Good. But I can ask whether you're making one mistake." "Go on. Which is?" "You're talking as if you only exist inside your own skull. I don't think that's true. If you raise a child, some of you goes into that child. If you teach a trade to a young lad, some of you carries on in his hands. If you were kind to somebody at the time and they badly needed it, the kindness can keep moving long after you're buried. I've seen that more than once, A man dies, and at the wake people start telling stories, little things, ordinary things. They'll say he lent them money when nobody else would, or he brought turf when their father was sick, or he fixed a gate and never charged for it. You stand there listening, and you realise the man is still causing things in the room. Then John said, "But that's memory, though. It's not survival." "I know. But that doesn't matter to me." "No, not fully." "Well, I'm glad you said that, because people always try to make memory sound like survival. It isn't, though. If my son remembers me, great. If something I taught him helps him, even better. But I'm not there. I don't get to see it. I don't get to hear him say my name. I don't get to sit at the table with them. Being remembered is good for the living. It doesn't solve the problem for the dead." Fran put the rag down. "You have a habit of taking away the easy answers." "I don't think they're answers." "Well, some of them are all people have. That doesn't make them true." "No, it doesn't." John looked at the loose coffin lid. "And I hate it when people say death gives life meaning. I know it sounds wise to some people, but I think it's nonsense. My life matters because I'm alive. My wife matters because I love her. A child matters because, well, a child matters. I don't need death standing in the corner to make those things valuable. If I smashed that coffin with a hammer, it wouldn't become more precious because it was gone." "Well, I agree with most of that." "You do?" "Yeah. I don't think death creates the value. That would be a strange thing to say. But I do think it changes how people notice the value. That's not the same thing. A man can love his wife and still act as if every apology can wait. He can love his children and still spend years coming home late and angry. He can love his brother and still refuse to speak first after some stupid argument. Then death enters the house, and suddenly all the things he already knew become urgent. Well, that doesn't make death good." "I didn't say it does." "It sounds like you're giving it credit." "I'm not. I'm saying people are slow, that's all. People put things off because they think there'll always be another week. Death proves there isn't always another week. I don't like that. I just pretend it isn't useful to remember." John said, "Useful is a cold word." "It's a cold subject." John leaned back. "Here's my problem with that. If a man only becomes decent because death scared him, then death didn't teach him decency. It frightened him into doing what he already knew he should have done. That's not wisdom. That's panic arriving late." Fran stopped working with the tools. "Another good point, I have to say." "It is." "I've seen it too. Men crying over coffins because they loved well, and men crying because they didn't. You can tell the difference sometimes. Not always, but sometimes. The regret was already there. Death only took away their chance to fix it." "See, that sounds more honest." "It is more honest." "Then maybe that's what death really is to most people. The end of chances." "Maybe." "And that doesn't scare you?" "Of course it does, if I think of it that way." John looked at him and said, "So you are afraid?" "No, I'm afraid of wasting my life. That's another thing entirely." "Ah, but it's connected though." "Right, it is, but it's not the same thing. If I'm afraid of leaving work unfinished, then the answer is to do the work. If I'm afraid of not saying what should be said, then the answer is to say it. If I'm afraid of death itself, there's no answer I can put my hands on, so I try to deal with the parts I can do something about." Then John said, "Well, that's practical." "It has to be. I'm a practical man." "That might be the first thing you've said tonight that fully sounds like you." Fran picked up the scraper again, then left it where it was. John said, "So, do you believe in anything after?" I don't know." "That's not giving me much." "It's what I have." "After 32 years in this room?" "Especially after 32 years in this room. I've seen bodies, I've seen grief, I've seen what sickness does. I've seen people die easy, I've seen people die hard. None of that tells me where they went. It tells me what they left, that's all." And John said, "And that's enough for you, is it?" "No, it isn't enough, but I got tired of demanding answers from a room that never gave me any." John watched him from beside the stove. "That sounds like giving up." "It is, in one way. You see, I don't like that." "I never said you had to." "I think a man should keep asking, And I think a man can ask until the question ruins his life. But that's fear talking. Maybe, or maybe it's experience. John said, I don't know which frightens me more, nothing after death or something after death. Fran turned that over. Something after death frightens you? Of course it does. People talk about an afterlife like it's automatically comforting. I don't see why. Forever's a long time. Even heaven, if you think about it properly, is strange. People picture meeting their mother again, seeing old friends, walking somewhere bright. They picture a reunion. They don't picture forever. Forever has no end. No change, maybe. No escape, maybe. I don't know why people are so calm about that. Fran said, well, that's another fair worry. And hell's worse, obviously. But even leaving hell aside, the idea of going on forever unsettles me almost as much as stopping. So I'm caught between two things. If there's nothing, I vanish. If there's something, I may be trapped in a thing I don't understand. Fran said, somehow you've made both doors unpleasant. I didn't make them, I'm just looking at them. That's why most people stop looking. Or maybe they're cowards. Or maybe they're just trying to get through Tuesday. John gave a small pause. You got me there? Fran walked to the coffin and checked the lid with his palm. I don't think most people are built to stare at death for too long. They can visit it. They can think about it when someone dies. They can kneel at a grave and feel the size of it for a while. But if they carry it into breakfast every morning, it starts eating everything else. I've watched that happen. A man loses his wife, and after that he doesn't just grieve her. He starts grieving himself in advance. Every ache becomes a warning. Every funeral becomes a rehearsal. He's alive, but he's already sitting in the waiting room. John said, and you think I'm doing that? A bit. I think I'm being honest. Well, you are, that's the problem. Too much honesty about certain things can become another kind of sickness. That sounds like something a coward would say. It might. It might also be true. John took that one properly, and Fran continued. I'm not telling you to pretend. I hate pretending. But there's a difference between knowing there's a grave ahead and climbing into it early to see how it feels. Then John said, do you know that's dangerously close to a clever line? I'll apologise in writing for you. John smiled, then pulled the subject back. Right, let me ask you this. If death doesn't frighten you, why would you fight to live? Because I like living. Come on, that's too easy. It's true. No, I mean, there's more to it. Every living thing fights to stay alive. People, animals, insects, everything. Pull a worm from the ground and it twists away from you. Catch a fish and it batters itself against a boat. A man drowning will grab at anything, even another person. So don't tell me death isn't frightening when every living thing spends its life avoiding it. Fran took longer with that. That's probably your best point. It is. And I don't have a tidy answer. Good. I'll give you the answer I do have. Wanting to live doesn't always mean fearing death. Sometimes it means life is doing what life does. A hand pulls back from the flame before the mind thinks. A body fights for air because bodies are made to keep going. I don't have to be terrified of death to prefer my supper tonight, my bed later, and the morning after that. John said, that's not enough. No, it isn't enough to beat your point, but it's enough to explain mine. I don't want to die tomorrow. I don't want to die next week. I'd be angry if a doctor told me I had a month. I'd be sorry for the work left undone and the people left dealing with it, but fear, the deep fear you're talking about, no, I don't live with that. Maybe you would if it came closer. Maybe, Fran said. That stayed between them longer than most of the answers had. Then John said, at least that was honest. I'm trying. Fran lifted the coffin lid and fitted it into place without fastening it. John watched the lid settle. What if you're wrong about being calm? I expect I am, partly. Partly? A man never knows himself completely until the test comes. I can sit here and say I'm not afraid. Maybe if a doctor gives me news tomorrow, I'll disgrace myself. I hope not, but I might. I've seen braver men than me break down. Then your whole argument is guesswork. So is yours. John accepted that with a tired look, and Fran said, "That's the trouble with death. Nobody speaks from experience except the people who can't speak." John turned toward the coffin. "And maybe that's the real cruelty." "What?" "That the people who know the answer are the only ones who can't tell us." "That's bothered me more than once," Fran said. Now we're getting somewhere. "I never claimed I had peace in every hour of the day. I said I'm not afraid in the way you are, that's all." John rose from the chair and put on his hat. "You know, I came here wanting you to convince me." "Nah, you didn't." John looked at him. "You came here wanting me to fail. That's what happened." "Maybe," John said, taking that in. Fran folded the cloth over the edge of the bench. "You don't want a neat answer. You'd hate one. If I gave you a neat answer, you'd tear it apart, and you'd be right to do it. What do you want as proof? You said it yourself." "I do." "And if proof came?" "I'd face it." I'm not so sure." "I am." "I think people imagine proof will come kindly, a voice in a dream, a mother at the foot of the bed, a little sign that says all is well. But proof mightn't be like that. It might be a sound in a room where there should be no sound. It might be confusing. It might tell you something continues without telling you whether it's good." John held his hat in both hands. "I'd still rather know." "I believe you." The workshop went quiet. A drop of water fell outside in the front. John moved toward the door. "For what it's worth, you've helped a bit." "Have I?" "Yep. You haven't made me less afraid, but you've made the fear feel less stupid." "That may be the best I can offer." John put his hand on the door, and a light tap came from inside the coffin. Both men turned. The sound came again, small and clear, like a fingernail against the inside of the lid. Fran stood beside the bench with the cloth still in his hand. John looked from Fran to the coffin. The third tap was softer than the first two. John stayed by the door. Fran didn't move toward the coffin, and after all their talk, no answer came quickly to either man. John simply lifted one eyebrow and said, "Well." The Keneally family reached the mountain turnout 20 minutes before the agreed time. Porrick stood beside the car with one hand on the roof and checked his watch again. Mist was coming in from the Atlantic, low and pale across the valley, and the tops of the hills were still hidden behind it. Michelle opened the boot and packed bottles of water into a rucksack. Sarah sat on a boulder near the ditch, pulling her laces tight through the hooks of her boots. "He's late," Porrick said. Michelle looked at her own watch. "He's not late. We said 8:30. It's only 25 past. "Well, he's late according to the schedule I had made in my own head." Sarah looked up from her boot. "Does that schedule exist anywhere else?" "That's where the important schedules are kept," Porrick said. A dry voice answered from behind the wall. "That's usually where the trouble starts as well." All three of them turned. An old man was stepping down from the heather bank onto the gravel. He was lean and weathered, with a faded green oilskin jacket and a brown canvas satchel across his chest. His face had the colour of a man who spent most of his life outdoors, and the skin around his eyes was deeply lined from years of looking into the west wind and the low sun. "The Keneally family, is it?" "That's us," Porrick said. The man gave him a polite nod. "Podge Tierney, sorry for keeping you waiting." "Sure, it was only a couple of minutes," Michelle said. Podge looked at Porrick. "I know, ma'am, but a couple of minutes is a long stretch to certain men." Porrick pointed at Michelle. "D'you see, the man understands punctuality." Podge looked up at the clouds sitting over the ridge. "I understand men who look at watches on mountains. They usually spend half the day angry with the sky." Sarah smiled at that and stood from the boulder. Within 10 minutes they had left the road behind. The track rose between two shoulders of heather and tall grass. Water moved beneath the moss in places, and the stones underfoot were slick from the night rain. Below them the valley began to open. with the road curving away toward the village and the rented cottages shrinking behind a field of rushes. Sarah stayed close to Podge. Most guides she had met talked as if they were reciting from a booklet. Podge didn't. He spoke only when asked, but when he did, every answer seemed to belong to the ground around them. She pointed toward a long stone wall running up a steep slope. "What was that wall for?" Podge stepped beside a fence post and took a pipe from his pocket. Well, that there's a famine wall." "What did it keep in?" "Nothing." Sarah looked at the wall again. "So why build it?" "Because men were hungry and someone with land decided hunger should still come with work attached. They paid them a few pence to carry stone up that hill. The wall never marked a field, it never kept cattle. It gave men a reason to be handed a meal without calling it charity." Porrick looked along the wall. "That's grim." "It is," Podge said, "but the stones kept children alive. That makes it harder to look at and easier to understand." They climbed on. After a time, the track brought them to the remains of a small cottage. The walls were still standing, built from heavy stones pulled from the land around it. The roof was gone, grass and nettles had taken the floor. Podge rested a hand on the doorway. "The Joyce family lived here when I was young, 8 of them in the house." "8?" Sarah asked. "In that?" "Aye." "There's barely enough room for 3. "There was room enough for 8 because nobody had a 9th place to go." Michelle stepped closer to the entrance. "Were they poor?" Podge gave her a careful look. "Poor's a broad word, ma'am. Some people have no money and still own themselves. Others have full pockets and live like frightened hens. The Joyces had little enough, but they were decent people." Sarah looked through the doorway. "What happened to them?" "One son went to Boston, one daughter married into Lannan. The mother died in that back room there. The father lasted 2 winters after her and then gave up annoying everyone." Sarah laughed. "Was he annoying?" "Oh, terribly. He had opinions on turf, weather, priests, trousers, soup, funerals, and every horse in the parish." Porrick said, "A man after me own heart." Michelle said, "That's not the compliment you think it is." Podge tucked the pipe into his back pocket. "Come on, the mountain is easier when you keep moving." The walk carried them higher into the hills. By late morning, Connemara opened below them in long folds of grey and green. Dark lakes sat in hollows between the slopes. A pale road threaded through the valley. Far out beyond the ridges, the Atlantic showed itself as a strip of light under the cloud. Podge pointed out old boundaries, abandoned fields, and the marks of lazy beds cut into the ground that looked too poor to grow anything. Sarah asked about each one. Podge answered each one. At the top of a broad stretch of bog, she stopped and pointed toward a circular mound of turf. A small hawthorn grew from the centre of it, bent sideways by years of wind. "Is that a fairy fort?" "That's what the old people called it." "Do you believe there's anything in it?" Podge looked at the mound. "I believe every sensible man in the parish leaves it alone when he's cutting turf." Michelle smiled. "That's a careful answer." "I've lived long enough to know that a straight answer can start 3 arguments in a family feud." The track carried them along the shoulder of the mountain, with the valley dropping away on their right. Sarah pointed toward a cluster of rocks standing apart from the rest of the hillside. "Is there a story attached to those as well?" "There's a story attached to every stone in Connemara if you ask the right question," Podge said. "What kind of stories?" Sarah asked. "The fairy stories, ghosts, spirits, all that. When I was a young lad, there was a man in leather frack who swore he saw lights moving across a bog every winter. He spent 20 years telling people about them. Half the parish called him a liar." "And the other half?" Sarah asked. "The other half had seen the lights themselves." "Did you?" "I saw lights on the bog." "What were they?" Podge smiled and said, "If I knew that, there'd be no story left." Michelle laughed. "That's another careful answer." "A careful answer usually lives longer than a careless one." They continued on up the slope, and after a minute, Sarah said, "Have you ever seen a ghost?" Podge looked out over the valley. "I've met people who claimed they had, There are places in these mountains where people don't like to walk alone. Because of ghosts. Because something happened there once. Sarah considered that and asked, "What happened?" "There was an old story when I started guiding about a guide himself who brought people into the hills." "A bad guide?" Porrick asked. "A dead guide." That got everyone's attention. The story said he would meet walkers, a pleasant man, full of history, knew every wall and every family that ever walked the mountain. Sarah smiled. "Sounds familiar." "Aye," Podge laughed. "He would walk with them for hours, show them the old ruins, tell them the stories. They would trust him completely." Michelle looked at Podge. "And then?" "He'd bring them to a place where people had died." "Did he kill them?" "No one could agree on that part." "Well, what happened?" "Some people said he was trying to save them. Others said he was trying to bring them with him." Sarah looked up at him. "What do you think?" "I always thought the mountain knew more about it than the people did." "Well, that's not much of an answer." "That's the only one I have, young Sarah." "Do you know anyone that ever met him?" Plenty of claims, but everybody likes to have their own story." Around noon, they stopped beside a stream that ran over red stones in a sheltered hollow. Michelle handed out sandwiches. Sarah took a large square of dark chocolate from her bag and offered it to Podge. "Emergency supplies." Podge accepted it with a serious little bow. "Good girl. If a chocolate famine breaks out before evening, we may yet save the county." He slipped it into his coat pocket. The sky changed while they ate. Cloud gathered across the higher ground, and the light left the slopes. The air cooled quickly, and Podge stood, brushed the crumbs from his coat, and looked toward the darker fold in the mountain. "There's one more place worth seeing before we turn back." Porrick checked the ridge above them. "Oh, great. How far?" "It's not far." They left the main path and took a narrower sheep track through wet peat. The ground softened under their feet. Rushes grew in clumps. The hills rose closer on either side, and the view of the sea disappeared behind them. The track dipped between two banks of black peat and entered a deep hollow. At first, Sarah thought it was another small mountain lake. Then she saw the water properly. It was still. Not a ripple moved across it, though the grass around the hollow bent under the wind. The pool lay dark in the ground, with yellow rushes along one side and an overhanging shelf of peat on the other. The bank near the shelf was dark red, where the moss met the weather. "What is this place?" Sarah asked. "The Black Pool," Podge said. Porrick stepped closer. "Is it deep?" "Oh, yeah, very deep." "How deep?" "No line ever found a clean bottom in the middle." Michelle folded her arms against the cold. "It looks smaller from above." "Aye," Podge said. "That's one of its better tricks." Sarah looked at the water. "Does anyone swim down there?" "No, no one with good sense." "Has anyone drowned?" "More than one," Podge said. Porrick took out his phone and held it toward the water. "The light is strange there. Can we take a photograph?" Take what you like." Podge moved down the bank and pointed with the stem of his pipe. "There's a flat stone below the shelf. You'll see how the water drops away beside it." Sarah stayed near Michelle as they went lower. The moss gave slightly under their feet. The pool seemed darker from this level, and the weeds near the edge vanished suddenly into black water, and Podge pointed again. "Do you see that stone there?" Porrick leaned forward with his phone. "Where?" "Near the red moss. 2 steps left and you'll have it." Porrick moved 1 foot, and then a sound came from the ridge above them. "Stop there." The sound struck the bank of the hollow. The Keneallys turned. A younger man was running down from the main track. He wore a yellow, waterproof jacket, and his boots slid on the wet grass as he came. He waved both arms as he ran. "Stay back from the edge." Porrick lowered the phone. "What's that lad at?" The man reached the bottom of the slope and stopped near them, breathing hard from the run. "I'm sorry," he said. "I'm so sorry. The van broke down on the low road. I had to come over the hill on foot." Porrick stared at him and asked, "What van?" The man pulled a laminated card from his jacket. "John O'Ford. I'm your guide from the office in Clifton. You're the Keneallys, aren't you?" Michelle turned toward the water. Where'd he go? Podge was gone. The place where he stood was empty. There was no oilskin coat by the bank, no satchel, and there was no cap. The red moss lay undisturbed beside the dark water. Sarah stepped closer to her mother. He was standing there. Jono looked at the empty bank, and the red in his face faded. Who was standing there? Our guide, Porrick said. Jono looked at him for a moment. What name did he give? Podge Tierney. Jono stared at the pool. The wind moved across the rushes above them, but the water stayed flat and black. Jono pointed up the bank. Right, we have to leave this hollow. And then Michelle said, Who was he? We'll talk up there. Tell us now. Jono looked at the water again. Please, up the bank first. The urgency in his voice moved them. They climbed from the hollow, one at a time, with Jono close behind them. He kept them away from the red moss and brought them back to the main sheep track. Only when the black pool was hidden behind the rise did he stop. Porrick turned on him. Right, explain. Jono took a moment to get his breathing under control. Right, Podge Tierney was a guide in these mountains 40 years ago. Was? Sarah asked. Jono nodded. He disappeared in 1986. Michelle looked back toward the ridge. At the pool? At the pool. Sarah looked down the track, back toward the places they had passed. He didn't seem dangerous. Jono took a careful breath. Well, that's the worst of it, Michelle said. Does he bring people to the pool? Jono looked toward the ridge behind them. Aye. How often? Every few years somebody reports it. Porrick folded his arms. And what happens? The same thing nearly every time. He gains their trust. He walks with them. He tells them stories. Eventually he brings them to the black pool. Sarah looked back toward the hidden hollow. Why? Jono let out a slow breath. Because that's where he died. The group stood quietly for a moment, and Michelle broke the silence. You think he was trying to kill us? Jono looked her dead in the eye and said, Aye. Nobody said anything to that, and then Sarah spoke first. But he was kind. I know that. He was helping us all morning. I know that too. He gave us history lessons. Jono nodded. That's exactly what people say. Porrick looked down the track. He told us about a dead guide. Jono looked back toward the ridge again. Well, I suppose he was talking about himself. They walked on and got to the turnout 20 minutes later. The car was where they had left it. Mist still moved across the lower fields. The road back toward town looked ordinary and safe. Michelle got into the passenger seat. Sarah climbed into the back and pulled the door closed. Porrick stayed outside with one hand on the roof of the car. He looked toward the gap between the heather banks where Podge had first stepped down that morning. The place was empty, still. Porrick could picture him clearly, the old green coat, the satchel strap across his chest, the pipe in his hand, the patient voice, ready with another story about the mountain. Porrick got into the car and started the engine. They drove south toward the town without much talk. Behind them, the ridges of Connemara settled back into the mist and evening cloud. Somewhere above the road, the famine walls still climbed the hill. The Joyce cottage still stood with grass inside the doorway. The black pool still waited in its hollow, dark under the peat bank, and somewhere on those tracks, Podge Tierney was still guiding people through the mountains, telling them the true names of places and leading them toward the last place he had ever known. The candle maker came into the village on a wet evening in October. He had no horse, no cart, and no man walking behind him with a box. He came on foot along the western road with a wooden case strapped across his back. The case was long and narrow and was wrapped in dark canvas to keep the rain from the wood. He stopped outside the public house and lowered the case onto the ground. The men inside saw him through the window. At first, they thought he was a poor child looking for shelter. He looked no older than 12 or 13. His trousers were patched and too short at the ankles. Mud clung to his bare shins. His shirt dangled beneath an oversized black coat that looked as if it had passed through several families before reaching him. His face was dirty from the road and ashen from the rain. His eyes were what people remembered later. They were clear, bright blue, too bright for the rest of him. They didn't make him look less human. They only made people look at him longer than they meant to. The publican opened the door. "Are you lost, son?" "No," the boy said. "I'm selling candles." The publican looked past him toward the wet road. "Where are your people?" The boy placed one hand on the wooden case. "I'm selling candles." The publican looked back at the men behind him. "Well, bring them in out of the rain if you've got candles worth seeing." The boy carried the case inside and set it on the table near the fire. When he opened it, the room went quiet. The candles lay in 3 neat rows. They were beautiful things. Some were deep red, like wine held close to flame. Some were blue, darker than the sky after rain. Some were green, rich and clean, like leaves seen through clear water. Each candle was thick and smooth, set into a small brass holder. The publican leaned over the case. "You made these yourself?" "I did." "With colour like that?" "With colour like that." The cooper bought the first one. He chose a green candle and said it would please his wife. He paid more for it than a careful man should have paid for wax, but nobody blamed him. The candle was lovely to look at. The boy wrapped it in brown paper. Before he handed it over, he asked one question. "Will this be for yourself?" The cooper smiled and said, "Well, it'll be for the house." "That's not the question I asked." The cooper looked at him properly then. "Oh, aye, okay, so yeah, it's for myself." The boy handed him the parcel. "Burn it as you please." The cooper put the green candle on the table near his fireplace. His wife lit it that Sunday evening, and the two of them sat watching the colour of it against the wall. It burned cleanly. No smoke rose from it. No wax ran down the side. Every evening when the cooper came in from work, he lit it for an hour beside his chair. By Christmas, the candle was half gone. By the first week in February, it had burned down to the rim of the brass holder. The cooper died before dawn the next morning. The doctor said his heart had given out. The priest said the prayers. The neighbours called it a sad turn because the cooper had seemed well enough the week before. Nobody spoke about the candle. A year later, the candlemaker came back. He arrived by the same western road with the same wooden box on his back. People recognized him before he reached the public house. That was the first thing they whispered about. The boy looked the same patched trousers, the same oversized coat, the same bare legs marked with road dirt, the same bright blue eyes. Every year had passed over him. It left no mark anyone could name. The tailor bought the blue candle. He was a careful man with money, and people were surprised to see him pay so much for anything that would be used up. He said the candle would look well in the front window of his shop. The boy wrapped it in paper. "Will this be for yourself?" "It'll be for the shop," said the tailor. The boy kept the parcel in his hand, and the tailor said, "Well, okay, so yeah, it's for myself." The boy handed it to him. "Then it's yours." The blue candle sat in the tailor's window for nearly 2 years. People saw it every day. It burned while he worked at the counter. It burned while he cut cloth. It burned on wet afternoons when customers came in to have cuffs let out or jackets taken in. At first, nobody thought much about it. After a while, people noticed how slowly it was lowering. The tailor joked about it. "That's the best money I ever spent," he said. That candle lasted longer than half the marriages in the parish. The joke worked for a while. Later, people only looked at the window. By the end of the second winter, the blue wax was almost gone. The tailor stopped lighting it for a week. People noticed that as well. On a Friday evening, he lit it again and placed it in the window. Some said he did it out of pride. Others said he wanted to prove the village foolish. Some said a man can only live so long under the rule of an unlit candle. The flame reached the brass before midnight. The next morning, the tailor's door stayed locked. They found him in the chair behind the counter with his glasses resting on an open page of his order book. After that, the talk began properly. The priest told people not to make wickedness out of coincidence. The doctor said there was no mark on either man and no illness in common that he could name. The publican said people were being ridiculous. When the candlemaker came back the third time, half the village watched him from their doorways before he reached the public house. The boy looked exactly as he had on the first visit. Same height, same face, same coat, same blue eyes. The publican stepped out before the boy had finished lowering the case. The men at the doorway went quiet. The publican pointed at the case. "I'll buy one so." His wife caught his arm from the doorway. "Leave it." "No," he said. "We'll put an end to this nonsense. Coincidence, nothing more." He chose the red candle. The boy wrapped it slowly. "Will this be for yourself?" "Yeah, for myself," said the publican. The boy passed it over. "Then burn it as you please." The red candle was placed behind the bar where everyone could see it. For the first month, the publican made a show of lighting it every evening. He joked that if he was going to die, he might as well do it with paying customers in the room. People laughed because they knew he expected them to. By the third month, the jokes had stopped. Men came in for porter and looked at the candle before they looked at him. Women passing the window slowed their steps. Children were told not to stare, which only taught them where to look. The publican lit it less often after that. Some evenings he left it dark. Some evenings, when the trade was good and the pride had more strength than sense, he struck a match and set the flame going again. The red wax dripped. Winter came. The candle reached the last inch. On the final night, the publican closed early. A few men had stayed late, but he sent them home before 10. They saw the candle burning behind him as he barred the door. The flame was small by then, sitting low in the brass holder. The public house didn't open the next morning. After that, no one in the village bought from the candlemaker again. But the story didn't stay there. Travellers carried it east. Drovers carried it south. A woman visiting her sister in another county heard of a green candle that had burned for 7 years before a miller died at his own table. A priest from the north wrote of a red candle locked in a sacristy press, still unlit because the man who bought it had lost courage before striking the first match. Nobody knew where the boy lived. Nobody knew where he made the wax. Nobody knew why he never grew older. All anyone knew was that he came by road, sold only to the person who claimed the candle for himself, and never forced a sale. Years passed. In some places, people said the candles killed. In other places, people said the candles warned. The oldest people gave the simplest account. They said the candles didn't take life from anyone. They only burned for the life already given. And when a person paid with their own hand and claimed one with their own mouth, the candlemaker measured what remained and wrapped it carefully in brown paper. When you wake in the morning, please like, subscribe, and leave a small comment. Tell me where you're listening from. Those quiet words and clicks are what keep this place alive. The soft signs that let the stories return again and again to you and to others. Come back every night. Let this be your resting place. Good night.